This is going to start out just a very short little introduction to neuroscience from Chapter 1. Nice short chapter. So the quest to understand the nervous system is called neuroscience. Neuroscience is a relatively new study concerned with development, chemistry, structure, function, and pathologic characteristics of the nervous system. So there are lots of different branches of neuroscience, and we are only going to be studying some of them because it's a very broad ranging subject. So there are different ways to analyze the nervous system. Molecular neuroscience investigates the chemistry and physics involved in neural function. Cellular neuroscience considers distinctions amongst different types of cells in the nervous system and how each cell type functions. So we are going to be, particularly in the first 8 chapters, talking a lot about this type of neuroscience. Interesting stuff. So systems, then after we do those introductory chapters, the systems neuroscience investigates groups of neurons that perform a common function. So that a lot of the rest of what we're going to do besides the first 4 weeks is going to be systems neuroscience. We're going to talk about all the different systems and how they perform together to do whatever the common function is. So it might be movement, it might be sensory, it might be the cognitive functions of the body. So it might be vital system functions. So by considering each system that is responsible for a common function, that's how we approach the nervous system that way. Behavioral neuroscience is a fascinating area which we will not be talking about pretty much at all. It examines the interaction among systems that influence behavior. Of course, any therapist has to be aware of behavioral neuroscience because we're working with human beings here. So there are things that are going on that influence their behavior, and a lot of it has to do with their nervous system. Many of the things that we talked a little bit in pathology last quarter about mental disorders, and many of the things that have been previously considered, I mean, they still are considered psychological and mental disorders, but they're neurochemical disorders. So it's not something that someone has control over. It is something that maybe they're getting better ways to treat because we know they're neurochemical disorders, but they really influence that person's behavior. So even though we're not going to specifically talk about it in this class or really practice behavioral neuroscience in the clinic, it is an area that's closely linked to rehabilitation therapies, and certainly anybody who works with human beings has to deal with behavioral neuroscience on some level. Cognitive neuroscience, another very interesting area covering the fields of thinking, learning, and memory. So studies for cognitive neuroscience focus on planning, language usage, and identifying the differences between memory for remembering specific events and memory for performing motor skills. So we will get into a lot of that in neuro rehab. How are we going to relearn motor skills after a CVA, for example, or any other kind of neurological assault to our systems? So we will talk a little bit about memory. We'll just hit on it briefly in this class, and we'll talk about the cognitive processes and how they're affected with different areas of the cerebrum, and we'll talk about language. But cognitive neuroscience is another whole area that is we're just going to briefly touch on, but not spend a lot of time on this quarter. So a lot of different things can be learned from the studies of neuroscience. So we're starting to, I was saying a lot of the things that were considered mental disorders are now considered neurochemical disorders. So how do ions influence nerve cell function? How is fluid balance in the body going to influence nerve cell function? Remember when we were talking about this last summer about alkalosis and acidosis, when we start getting into the hyperkalemic and hypernatremic and other ion dysfunction, how does that influence nerve cell dysfunction? So a lot of the manifestations of those things are muscle weakness, because we have to have our nerve cells working well to get those muscle contractions to work well. So how language is formed and understood, very interesting area. I'm lucky I work in a multidisciplinary clinic, so we get to work with speech-language pathologists, and they really have a lot of interesting perspective on the rehabilitation of some of our patients. So when we're working with someone who has aphasia after a stroke or a brain injury, language formation and understanding is a big, huge part of rehabilitation. So the other thing is, how can physical therapy and occupational therapy assist a patient in regaining maximal independence after neurologic injury? That's the meat of what we want to learn from these neuroscience studies. So clients with neurological disorders are not confined to neurologic rehabilitation. A lot of times it's a team approach with neuropsychologists, neuro-ophthalmologists, prosthetic and orthotic specialists. So lots of different rehabilitation goes into rehabbing from a neurologic condition. But regardless of the area of specialty, all of these therapists have to have a basic, thorough knowledge of neuroscience in order to treat these patients. So it's really interesting. The other area that neuroscience is really coming into its own in is chronic pain management, and not just chronic pain management, but management of pain after an orthopedic injury. How does it affect someone's sports performance? How does it affect someone's life in their job and every other parts of their activities? So it's really interesting, and neuroscience can shed a light on a lot of these areas. So the book is organized in 5 different sections. The first is the neurology overview, and that's what we're in right now. And it's really the first 4 chapters. Then we start to go to the cellular level. So the cells of the nervous system are the neurons, of course, and the glial cells, which we'll talk about all the individual cells and how they function in the whole nervous system. And that's pretty much chapters 5 and 6. Section 3 is the development of the nervous system. Chapters 7 and 8 about neuroplasticity and actually developing the nervous system. That's what we talk about in the development system, and it's really an interesting area and very relevant to rehabilitation. Then we start talking about vertical systems. So there are really 3 vertical systems: the autonomic system, the somatosensory system, and the motor system. And we call them vertical systems because all of them have tracts of neurons that run together that perform common function, and they go vertically from the central nervous system out to the peripheral nervous system. The last section of the book focuses on regions of the nervous system. The 4 regions of the nervous system are the peripheral nervous system, the spinal and brain stem and cerebellar part of the central nervous system, and the cerebral area. So we will talk about all of those different things in the course of this chapter. So there are clinical cases in most of the chapters, and some of our assignments this quarter are going to be case study assignments, which are always very interesting. So the reason we do case studies, even though as physical therapist assistants we don't really do diagnosis, but it helps you develop clinical reasoning, and it helps you develop pattern recognition, and pattern recognition is really important for rehabilitation treatment. So there are questions at the end of each chapter that help to spur that idea of clinical reasoning. Never a bad thing to consider. So definitely it helps you, by doing the clinical reasoning practice, it helps you integrate and conceptualize all of the information.